Like many people who were not alive in 1969, I first heard of Paint Your Wagon from The Simpsons. The premise is pretty simple. It's about a yellow man with 8 fingers who works at a nuclear power plant. And he rents the movie thinking it will be full of violent mayhem. After all, it's a Western starring Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin. Well, turns out it's a Western, but it's also a musical, and there's very little violent mayhem in this film. So the movie is a big misfire for Homer and Bart, but maybe it's the perfect film, the perfect oddity for this channel. At least that's what I was thinking before I realized that it's 2 hours and 45 minutes long, which is a bit of a sacrifice. To be fair, that includes the intermission and some exit music. It turns out that the Simpsons spoof of this movie doesn't quite capture the essence of things, which is actually slightly surprising because the show portrays this as a ridiculous movie, and it is a ridiculous movie, but not quite in the same way. I won't dwell on this too much, but the show is latching onto the incongruity of Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin singing. They're tough guys. Why are they singing? Of course, Lee Marvin wasn't a total stranger to comedic roles, having won an Academy Award for playing 2 characters in Cat Ballou, a video that I have, a movie that I have a video about. And I'll talk about the similarities between these 2 films a little bit more later on. Anyway, yes, it is a little bit surprising to see these guys in a musical, but the film doesn't bat an eye. Clint Eastwood can sing pretty well, and it's really him singing in the movie. Lee Marvin singing is a bit more like talking, but it's okay. Gene Seberg is also in the movie, but her singing was dubbed. There are a few moments of coy self-reference in this film. For instance, Eastwood's character goes by partner for most of the movie, but towards the end, Lee Marvin says, "Hey, what is your name?" That's probably a nod to the many unnamed characters that Clint Eastwood played, including in his spaghetti western era. When we first meet Clint, he pretty quickly establishes that he doesn't drink, he doesn't fight, because, hey, he's got quite a temper, and once he starts fighting, he can't stop. Maybe that's also a nod to some of his earlier work. Interestingly, Lee Marvin is kind of the grittier guy in this film, and Clint Eastwood is sort of the softer one. That's a reversal from some films, perhaps. Besides these moments, I don't think the movie leans too heavily on either of the past lives of these characters. It gets its laughs from other sorts of jokes. In addition to being a musical, this is also a comedy, and it's pretty funny, but there are also long stretches without any jokes or without much humor. If you just want to know whether or not this movie is good, I'll stop wasting your time, and I'll tell you that it's decent, but it is a little bit too long, and it struggles to lift its own weight. There is too much nothing in this movie. There are long stretches where it doesn't seem like anything is driving the story. You look behind the wheel. Who's driving this thing? Nobody. At one point, they go so far as to sing a song about the weather. Ironically, it's the best song in the movie. They call the wind Mariah. Or they call the wind Mariah. It's actually an old Israeli folk song, at least according to Tom Smothers. Anyway, I think if you're really into the characters or the frontier feeling, you might not mind the pacing, but I didn't find either one of those things to be particularly compelling. The movie does have some clever angles in it. It has some good jokes. It has some nice set pieces, some good cinematography. It's a big production. But overall, it's a bit forgettable. And how could Clint Eastwood in a Western be forgettable? Well, that's this movie. It's far worse than something like Cat Ballou. That said, if you care more about whether or not a film is interesting than whether it's good, there are a few aspects of this movie that will catch your eye. First of all, let me clarify what I mean by a Western. When you think of Clint Eastwood, you might think of dust, but this is not a very dusty film. It's a gold rush film set in California, but filmed in Baker City, Oregon, which is a lot less dusty than Spain. Besides temperature, another way to classify Westerns is by their relationships with civilizations, their settings, I guess, the different locations. There's some stock locations and how they crop up, how they're structured, and how they structure the film. There are some Westerns that are really grounded in towns, for instance, like High Noon, where a town is defending itself from unattached strangers. Some movies do exactly the opposite, like Bad Day at Black Rock. Of course, Cat Ballou is somewhere in there. A town is usually a big logical thing in some of these Westerns, and especially in some of the serial television shows. A ranch or a farm is another common setting. Some movies don't really have towns in them at all, but there's a plot of land that matters. Other films don't have either of these things, and they're just focused on grifters wandering around, passing through. This movie doesn't quite fit into these categories. It's sort of about a town. It tells the story of a town being built, and there are a number of films like that, but there's no sheriff in this movie, no showdown on Main Street. more than anything, this is a movie about the frontier. There's a pinch of how the West was won here, although what I'm most reminded of is actually a movie called The Hanging Tree. Add in a pinch of Cat Ballou, and with those three, you're pretty close to this movie. Although there are a couple of things in it that none of them would dream about. The frontier story has a fantasy element to it, of course. It seems like it's probably a male fantasy, finding gold, stumbling home drunk, eating gravel. The good old days, Most Westerns are invested in a certain type of rugged manliness. Here in New York, the closest people probably get to this frontier fantasy is by growing a mullet. Maybe in other parts of the country, this still resonates, but there are far fewer Westerns these days. One of the most striking things about Paint Your Wagon is just how much time it devotes to domestic politics. You would think that a Western would have at least a little bit of shooting in it, even if it's a musical. But this movie swaps out all of the traditional excitement for a story of household configuration. And I'm not talking about romance, exactly. There is actually very little romance in this movie in some ways. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the plot here than usual, because it will pull back the curtain here, and you're probably not going to watch this movie anyway. At the beginning of the film, we get a hint of this focus when Clint Eastwood sings a song about missing his girl. That's kind of our introduction to him. He's strumming his guitar and singing a song. Seems like, is there going to be a love story incoming? Well, hold your horses a little bit. Turns out he doesn't have a girl, and in fact, nobody in town does. The story takes place in No Name City. No Name City, a pretty degenerate place that grew from a gold claim. There's a pretty good joke at the beginning of the film, actually, where we see someone painting the town's first sign. It says No Name City, population, but then the painter is standing in front of the sign. So what does it say? You're trying to see what's written behind the population. You can see part of it. It's a well-executed little joke, a clever shot. And when he steps back, you see that it says population male. This is not an uncommon angle for these frontier movies, but things do take a little bit of a turn when someone rides into town with not just one, but two women. And it turns out he's married to both of them. What? Well, one thing leads to another, and this guy decides to sell one of his wives to Lee Marvin. There aren't really any laws in the town, which isn't located in any state, so it's no problem to sell your wife, but they do need some quick thinking to figure out how to officiate a marriage. Seems like maybe there hasn't been one there before. It's decided that a woman can simply be treated like a mining claim, and at the altar, Lee Marvin is granted access to all of Gene Seberg's mineral resources. Hold on a second, Lee Marvin marries Gene Seberg, but isn't Clint Eastwood the young heartthrob? And by the way, if you've forgotten what a young, non-grumpy version of Clint Eastwood is like, this movie is a good reminder. Surely he's going to get the girl in the end, right? They're going to be a love triangle? Yeah, right, this is what's going to happen. There's going to be a love triangle between these two partners, these two mining partners, over this woman. There's going to be a showdown at the town center, right? Well, no. Instead, Lee Marvin and Clint Eastwood decide, rather undramatically, with Gene Seberg as well, that they will both be married to her. So this movie treats women like mining claims, but also promotes polygamy or polyamory. In fact, this is probably the most positive portrayal of polygamy I've ever seen in a classic movie. Bit surprising. This is 1969, so okay, I guess maybe that makes sense. This movie gives Gene Seberg some spunky lines. She stands up for herself a few times, but when she does so, she advocates for some pretty traditional ideas for the type of homemaker she wants to become. By the way, if you haven't read Gene Seberg's Wikipedia page, you should. So anyway, how does this movie flirt both with these really progressive and really regressive things? Well, it turns out that a lot of mainstream movies do this, and a great example is Cat Ballou, a Jane Fonda Western that is kind of traditional but also activist. This movie is not as progressive as that one, but it's a similar kind of balance. These opposing currents actually do have an ideological connection, though, which is lawlessness, or you might say freedom. There are no protections for women. They can be bought and sold, but also there's no law against having two husbands. This is really not a moralistic movie. I don't think any of this stuff is intended exactly as a parable, but there is a little bit of a libertarian thing going on here. You might think that a lot of Westerns would be about lawlessness, but usually it's the opposite. They're actually fixated on the restoration of order, right? Lawlessness is a bad thing. Well, this movie is not. It's kind of a meditation on this place where there is no law, and it's sort of an endearing portrait of a town that isn't in any state, much like The Simpsons, of course. So maybe there's a hint of an idea here, a hint of something interesting, but mainly this movie is it's probably just trying to cater to too many different crowds at once. I think producers are often trying to build as broad a coalition as possible. They want to make safe movies that respectable families will see, but also hip movies that young people will see and talk about. Paint Your Wagon is an adaptation of a Broadway play, but it's a very loose adaptation. It was penned by none other than Paddy Chayefsky, actually, which is kind of surprising. I reviewed his film The Hospital on this channel, and it ain't like this one. He also did Network and Altered States, which are also nothing like Paint Your Wagon. He might be one of the reasons why there's some bolder ideas in this movie. There were a few failed attempts to adapt this play before this. I think a lot of this pre-production and writing phase, a lot of this hand-wringing, isn't so much about coming up with a good story. I mean, the play already had a story. I don't really know what the differences are, but often this is all about how to position the story within the mainstream, how to build the coalition. The filming of this movie was a bit of a disaster. That's somewhat well documented. The box office reception was okay, but not great, and the movie has since lived right on the verge of notoriety. Let me finish by mentioning that religion is another theme in this movie. Mostly it's satire. The lawlessness that we've been talking about is at odds with religious life. There are a lot of Westerns with religious themes, like The Hanging Tree, again, or Friendly Persuasion, where Gary Cooper plays a Quaker during the Civil War, Quaker family during the Civil War. Maybe that's not quite a Western, but it's an interesting movie with a young Tony Perkins in his unbearably wholesome era. I don't have a lot more to say about the religion in this movie, but it is another balancing act in some ways. I think here it's slightly more on the satirical side of things, but hey, you do wonder, 1969, so is this movie going to have a radical ending? Are they going to end up in a polygamous relationship? Will it skewer the preacher character all the way through, or are they going to have some sort of contrived narrative victory in the end, in the style of classic Hollywood? And to answer that question, you'll have to watch the movie. Although I'll give you one hint, this movie would be a lot more famous if it had been a bit bolder at the end, and they just picked up the pace a little bit. I wouldn't really recommend watching Paint Your Wagon. To be honest, the music is not too special, and you can get your kicks seeing Clint Eastwood sing just by watching a few minutes of that on YouTube.